On a windswept island off the Atlantic coast, wild horses still run free. No fences, no feed troughs, no human hands guiding them. 40 years ago, there were only 24 of them left. Today, researchers count hundreds. But something strange happened along the way. The island itself began to change. Grasslands that once stretched for miles started disappearing. Freshwater ponds that had existed for generations began drying up. And certain plants, some found nowhere else on Earth, started vanishing from the landscape entirely. At first, biologists thought it was drought. Then they thought it was climate change. But the pattern didn't match either explanation. Something else was reshaping this island, something tied directly to the horses themselves. What started as a rescue mission, an attempt to save a dying herd, may have set off a chain of events no one predicted. And 40 years later, scientists are still trying to understand exactly what they unleashed. This is the story of an island that saved its horses, and the horses that quietly rewrote the island's future. The island sits nearly 30 miles off the mainland. Cold Atlantic winds hit its dunes almost every day of the year. Few people ever settle here permanently. But wild horses have lived on this stretch of coastline for centuries. By the 1980s, their numbers had collapsed. Overgrazing on the mainland ranch where they once roamed had stripped the land bare. Disease had spread through the herd. Only 24 horses remained. A wildlife biologist working with a small conservation group made a decision that seemed simple at the time. Move the herd to an isolated island. No predators, no competition, no further human interference. It looked like a straightforward rescue. The horses were loaded onto barges and shipped across open water. Locals who watched the transfer described it as strangely quiet. No cheering, no celebration. Just 24 animals stepping onto unfamiliar ground. For the first few years, everything seemed to go right. The herd grew steadily. Foals were born every spring. Rangers monitoring the island reported healthy grass, stable dunes, and a thriving ecosystem. But by the early 1990s, something changed. A ranger doing a routine survey noticed a section of dune grass had thinned out almost overnight. He assumed it was erosion from a recent storm. He filed a short note and moved on. He had no way of knowing that this single patch of missing grass was the first visible sign of something much bigger, something that wouldn't be fully understood for another 2 decades. 10 years passed before anyone connected the dots. By the mid-1990s, more rangers began noticing the same pattern. Grass disappearing in patches, dunes shifting faster than expected. One ranger, who had worked the island for over a decade, said it felt like watching the land lose weight. At first, the local wildlife office dismissed it as normal coastal erosion. Islands shift, sand moves. That was the official explanation. But a visiting ecologist wasn't convinced. He'd studied barrier islands for years, and this didn't match anything he'd seen before. The erosion wasn't random. It was concentrated in specific zones, always near freshwater ponds, always where the horses gathered most. He began walking the island on foot, taking notes, comparing old aerial photographs to new ones. What he found unsettled him. In some areas, vegetation cover had dropped by more than half in under 15 years. Ponds that appeared full and healthy in 1985 photographs were now cracked and dry. He brought his findings to the state wildlife agency. Their response was cautious, skeptical even. Wild horses had lived on barrier islands for generations elsewhere without causing this kind of damage. Why would this herd be different? The ecologist didn't have an answer yet, but he suspected the herd itself held the key. He requested funding for a full population survey. What the count revealed would change everything. The herd wasn't just recovering. It had grown far beyond anyone's original projections, and nobody could explain why the island wasn't keeping up. The survey team expected maybe 80, 90 horses at most. The real number stopped them cold. Over 160 horses now roamed the island, more than 6 times the original herd. For a species with no natural predators on the island, the math was brutal. No wolves, no mountain lions, nothing to keep the population in check. Just open grass, fresh water, and time. The ecologist realized the successful rescue everyone celebrated at a hidden cost. Too much success. He compared horse density here to herds on other protected islands. This population was nearly triple the sustainable limit for the land available. One ranger described walking a section of coastline he remembered as thick, waist-high grass in his childhood. Now it was packed dirt, hoofprints layered over hoofprints. Something worse turned up in the water samples. Pond salinity levels were rising fast. Some ponds nearly twice as salty as they'd been a decade earlier. Freshwater sources the horses depended on were slowly turning against them. Nobody had expected that. The ecologist began to suspect the horses weren't just eating the grass. They were changing the entire water table beneath the island. If that was true, this wasn't a grazing problem anymore. It was something far more dangerous, a slow, invisible collapse of the island's entire freshwater system. And if the ponds kept failing, the horses that had finally been saved might end up trapped on an island that could no longer support them. The next question terrified him. Was it already too late to reverse it? The answer came from an unexpected source. A hydrologist brought in to study the ponds found something the ecologist hadn't considered. The island's fresh water didn't come from rain alone. It sat in a thin underground layer, a lens of fresh water floating on top of denser salt water beneath the island. That lens was fragile. Disturb the surface too much, strip away too much vegetation, and salt water could creep upward, contaminating the fresh water above it. The horses weren't just eating grass. Their constant grazing and trampling had stripped away root systems that once held the sandy soil together. Without those roots, rainwater no longer soaked in the way it used to. Instead, it ran off, taking topsoil with it. The dunes that once buffered the island from ocean spray were eroding faster than they could rebuild, and every storm made it worse. The hydrologist ran the numbers twice because he didn't believe them the first time. At the current rate of vegetation loss, several of the island's ponds could turn undrinkable within another decade. For horses that had no other water source, that was a death sentence. One rancher who had followed the herd's story for years called it heartbreaking. They rescued them from starvation on the mainland, he said, just to slowly starve them again, this time from thirst. But there was one detail that didn't fit. If the ponds were failing this fast, why hadn't the herd's health already collapsed? Something was keeping them alive, something no one had documented yet. And when researchers finally found it, It changed how they viewed the entire island. The discovery came from a young ranger reviewing drone footage nobody had bothered to analyze closely. In the shallow marshes on the island's northern tip, a handful of ponds looked different, greener, fuller, untouched by the salt creeping through the rest of the island. These ponds sat behind a natural ridge of dune grass that had somehow survived the grazing pressure. That ridge, researchers realized, was the only thing keeping salt water from reaching this last freshwater refuge. The horses had learned to concentrate around these surviving ponds, unknowingly protecting the very ecosystem keeping them alive. It wasn't planned, it wasn't intentional, but it was the only reason the herd hadn't already collapsed. Wildlife officials moved fast once they understood what was at stake. A rotational grazing barrier was installed, fencing off severely damaged zones to let vegetation recover. Supplemental water stations were added as a temporary buffer while root systems rebuilt naturally. For the first time in years, biologists watched dune grass return to areas once stripped bare. It was slow. It took nearly a decade to stabilize. But by the time researchers ran their most recent survey, salinity levels in the core ponds had dropped for 3 straight years. The herd had also stabilized, no longer exploding in size, held in balance by managed limits on available grazing land. Today, the island looks different from both the barren years and the original wilderness before the horses arrived. It's something in between, a landscape permanently reshaped by an act meant to save, not destroy. The horses survived, but the island they saved them on will never be the same again. Sometimes, rescuing one thing means changing everything else around it. If you want more true stories where good intentions collided with nature's hidden rules, subscribe. More of these are coming.